The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty military compound as Sarah Martinez adjusted her tactical vest one final time. As a military police officer stationed at Camp Pendleton, she had seen her share of dangerous situations, but something felt different about today. The intelligence reports had been coming in all week about increased activity in the surrounding areas, and tension hung thick in the California air. Sarah had joined the military straight out of high school, driven by a deep sense of duty and a desire to serve her country. At 24, she had already proven herself countless times, earning the respect of her fellow Marines through her unwavering dedication and quick thinking under pressure. Her colleagues often joked that she had nerves of steel, but Sarah knew that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about doing what needed to be done despite the fear. That particular Tuesday started like any other. Sarah completed her morning routine, checked her equipment, and briefed with her unit about the day's patrol assignments. The base had been on heightened alert for weeks following reports of suspicious activity near the perimeter. Local law enforcement had requested additional support, and Sarah's unit was tasked with providing security for a convoy transporting sensitive equipment through a potentially dangerous corridor. As she walked through the barracks, Sarah noticed the younger Marines seemed more nervous than usual. Many of them were fresh out of basic training, still adjusting to the reality of military life. She made it a point to offer reassuring words and share her experience, understanding that leadership wasn't just about rank. It was about lifting others up when they needed it most. The briefing room buzzed with quiet conversation as officers reviewed maps and discussed potential routes. Colonel Hayes, a veteran with over 20 years of service, outlined the mission parameters with his characteristic precision. The convoy would travel through a stretch of highway, known for its vulnerability to attacks, and intelligence suggested that hostile forces might attempt to intercept the transport. Sarah listened intently as the colonel explained their role in the operation. Her unit would provide escort security, maintaining defensive positions around the convoy vehicles. It was a routine assignment on paper, but everyone in the room understood that routine could turn deadly in an instant. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she realized that the safety of dozens of personnel would depend on their vigilance and quick reactions. After the briefing, Sarah spent time checking and double-checking her gear. Her rifle was clean and properly maintained, her radio equipment functioned perfectly, and her protective equipment was secure. She had learned early in her career that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Other Marines followed her example, creating an atmosphere of professional preparation that helped calm pre-mission nerves. The convoy vehicles lined up in formation as the sun reached its peak. Heavy trucks loaded with crucial supplies and equipment stretched out along the staging area, while Humvees took their positions at strategic intervals. Sarah climbed into her assigned vehicle, scanning the faces of her fellow Marines. She saw determination mixed with apprehension, young faces marked by the seriousness of their duty. As they rolled out of the base gates, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied every mission. The landscape outside changed from the organized safety of the military compound to the unpredictable terrain of the outside world. Rolling hills covered in dry grass stretched to the horizon, interrupted by patches of dense vegetation that could conceal threats. The radio crackled with periodic updates from command and reports from scout vehicles ahead of the convoy. Everything seemed normal for the first hour of travel, but Sarah remained alert, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for anything unusual. She had learned to trust her instincts, and something about the quietness of the route made her uneasy. Traffic was lighter than expected for the time of day, and the absence of civilian vehicles struck her as odd. Local residents usually went about their daily business regardless of military movements, but today the road seemed almost abandoned. Sarah mentioned her observation to her vehicle commander, who nodded grimly and increased their alert status. The convoy maintained steady progress through the first checkpoint, where local law enforcement confirmed that the route ahead remained clear. However, intelligence reports continued to suggest possible hostile activity in the area. Sarah checked her equipment one more time and mentally reviewed the emergency procedures they had drilled countless times during training. As they approached, a narrow section of highway flanked by dense brush on both sides. Sarah's uneasiness grew stronger. The terrain created perfect conditions for an ambush, with multiple concealment options for potential attackers. She adjusted her position to get a better view of the surrounding area, her finger resting near the safety of her weapon. The radio chatter indicated that advanced scouts had detected movement in the vegetation ahead, but nothing concrete enough to halt the convoy. Command made the decision to proceed with increased caution, knowing that stopping in such a vulnerable location could be even more dangerous than continuing forward. Sarah's vehicle rounded a slight bend in the road when the first shots rang out across the quiet afternoon air. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the afternoon silence, sending birds exploding from the nearby trees in a panicked flutter of wings. Sarah's training kicked in immediately as she identified the direction of the attack and began coordinating her unit's response. The hostile fire was coming from elevated positions on both sides of the highway, suggesting a well-planned ambush designed to trap the convoy in a deadly crossfire. Within seconds, the convoy transformed from a routine transport operation into a full-scale combat situation. Vehicle commanders shouted orders over the radio while Marines took defensive positions behind their vehicles and returned fire toward the concealed attackers. The sound of automatic weapons echoed off the surrounding hills, creating a chaotic symphony of warfare that Sarah had experienced before, but never grew accustomed to. The lead vehicle reported taking heavy fire from the hillside to the north, while Sarah's position came under attack from gunmen hidden in the dense brush to the south. She could see muzzle flashes between the trees but struggled to identify specific targets through the thick vegetation. The attackers had chosen their position well, using the natural terrain to their advantage while leaving the convoy exposed on the open roadway. Private Johnson, a 19-year-old Marine on his first deployment, crouched behind Sarah's vehicle with his rifle raised but his hands shaking visibly. Sarah recognized the signs of combat stress and moved quickly to his position, placing a steady hand on his shoulder while maintaining her own defensive watch. She spoke calmly but firmly, reminding him of their training and helping him focus on his assigned sector of responsibility. The convoy commander's voice crackled over the radio, reporting that the rear vehicles were also taking fire from a third group of attackers who had moved into position behind them. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into a complex ambush with the Marines caught in the middle of overlapping fields of fire. Standard protocol called for aggressive movement to break contact, but the terrain limited their options for maneuvering the heavy vehicles. Sarah noticed that one of the supply trucks had taken multiple hits and was beginning to smoke from its engine compartment. The driver and his assistant were trapped inside, unable to exit safely due to the intense fire coming from their left side. Without the cover of their vehicle, they would be completely exposed to enemy gunfire. But staying inside a potentially burning vehicle presented its own deadly risks. Combat medic Corporal Williams called out that he had casualties in the second vehicle and needed to move wounded Marines to a more secure position. Sarah could see him attempting to treat an injured soldier, while bullets struck the pavement around them, sending up small clouds of concrete dust with each impact. The medic's position was dangerously exposed, and he needed covering fire to complete his life-saving work. The intensity of the enemy fire suggested that the attackers had significant numbers and were well armed with military-grade weapons. Intelligence had underestimated the threat level, and the convoy found itself facing a much larger and more organized force than anticipated. Sarah realized that their survival would depend on aggressive tactics and coordinated teamwork under the most challenging circumstances. She identified a position among the rocks on the south side of the road that would provide better cover and a clear field of fire toward the enemy positions. Moving to that location would require crossing approximately 30 yards of open ground under direct enemy observation, but it would allow her to provide suppressing fire for the trapped Marines and potentially disrupt the attackers' coordination. Sarah communicated her plan to her squad leader, who initially hesitated due to the obvious risks involved. However, as the situation continued to deteriorate and more Marines found themselves pinned down by enemy fire, he reluctantly approved her proposal. The success of the maneuver would depend on precise timing and the ability of other Marines to provide covering fire during her movement. The radio reported that air support was en route but would not arrive for at least 15 minutes. Artillery support was also available, but could not be used effectively due to the close proximity of friendly and enemy forces. The Marines would have to rely on their own skills and courage to survive until Additional help arrived or they could break contact. With the attacking force, Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared for the dangerous dash across open ground. She knew that the enemy gunners would likely concentrate their fire on anyone attempting to move between positions, making her journey extremely hazardous. However, the alternative was to remain pinned down while her fellow Marines faced increasing danger from the well-coordinated attack. Private Johnson volunteered to provide covering fire for Sarah's movement, his earlier nervousness replaced by determined focus. Other Marines in nearby positions also acknowledged their role in the plan, understanding that Sarah's success would improve their overall tactical situation. The coordination required split-second timing and absolute trust in each other's abilities. Sarah took several deep breaths and visualized her route to the rocky position, identifying potential cover points along the way where she could pause if necessary. The distance seemed much greater now than it had during her initial assessment, but she pushed aside her doubts and focused on the mission at hand. Her fellow Marines were counting on her, and she would not let them down. The signal came over the radio and Sarah burst from cover as her teammates opened fire on the enemy positions. Bullets immediately began striking the ground around her as the attackers shifted their attention to this new threat, moving across their field of fire. Sarah sprinted across the open ground with bullets whistling past her head and kicking up dirt at her feet. Her teammates' covering fire was keeping most of the enemy gunners suppressed, but several persistent shooters continued to track her movement across the killing zone. Time seemed to slow as she focused entirely on reaching the rocky outcropping that would provide the cover she desperately needed. Halfway to her destination, Sarah heard a sharp cry from behind her and glanced back to see Private Johnson stumbling backward from his firing position. A bullet had struck his shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his rifle. Without his covering fire, the enemy gunners immediately increased their focus on Sarah's exposed position, forcing her to dive behind a small depression in the ground. The shallow dip in the terrain provided minimal protection, but it was better than being completely exposed on the open roadway. Sarah could hear bullets snapping overhead and striking the ground around her hiding spot with increasing frequency. She realized that staying in this position would eventually result in her being hit, but moving forward would require her to cross another 20 yards of open ground without adequate covering fire. From her prone position, Sarah could see that Private Johnson was attempting to apply pressure to his wounded shoulder, while other Marines tried to provide medical assistance. The young soldier was clearly in pain, but showed remarkable courage by attempting to return to his weapon despite his injury. Sarah knew that his dedication was typical of the Marines around her, but she also recognized that he needed immediate medical attention. The radio crackled with reports that Corporal Williams, the combat medic, was also wounded and unable to continue treating casualties. 2 other Marines had sustained injuries from the intense enemy fire, leaving the unit with mounting casualties and diminished fighting capability. Sarah understood that the situation was becoming critical and that decisive action was needed to prevent further losses. She made the difficult decision to abandon her original plan and instead focus on reaching Private Johnson's position to provide medical assistance and restore the defensive perimeter. This would require retracing her path across the same dangerous ground she had just crossed, but the alternative was allowing a wounded Marine to remain exposed to enemy fire without proper medical care. Sarah began low-crawling back toward the convoy, using every available piece of cover to mask her movement from the enemy gunners. The process was slow and exhausting, requiring her to move only a few feet at a time while bullets continued to strike the ground around her. Sweat dripped into her eyes despite the cool afternoon air, and her muscles burned from the constant tension of staying low while wearing full combat gear. As she reached the halfway point of her return journey, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of an enemy grenade launcher firing from the hillside above. She had seconds to react as the projectile arced through the air toward the convoy vehicles. Without hesitation, she shouted a warning to her fellow Marines and dove toward Private Johnson's position, hoping to shield him from the blast with her own body. The grenade exploded approximately 10 feet from their location, sending shrapnel flying in all directions and creating a cloud of dust and debris that temporarily obscured the battlefield. Sarah felt the concussion wave wash over her and heard the ringing in her ears that indicated she had been too close to the blast. Sharp fragments of metal struck her protective vest and helmet, but her equipment absorbed most of the impact. Private Johnson had been partially protected by Sarah's body and the vehicle behind him, but the explosion had aggravated his shoulder wound and left him disoriented from the concussion. Sarah quickly assessed his condition and determined that while his injuries were serious, they were not immediately life-threatening if he received proper medical care. She applied pressure to his wound using a bandage from her first aid kit, while scanning the area for additional threats. The grenade explosion had temporarily suppressed some of the enemy fire, but Sarah could hear voices shouting in a foreign language from the hillside positions. It sounded like the attackers were coordinating for another assault, possibly involving more explosive devices or a ground attack on the convoy positions. She realized that time was running out, and that her unit needed to either break contact or find a way to neutralize the enemy positions. Sarah's radio had been damaged during the explosion, leaving her unable to communicate directly with the convoy commander or request specific support. She could hear fragmentary transmissions from other Marines, but the radio traffic was chaotic and difficult to understand through the static and interference. This communication breakdown added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Looking around the battlefield, Sarah could see that several Marines had been wounded, and that their defensive positions were becoming untenable. The enemy had superior numbers, better positions, and appeared to be well supplied with ammunition and explosives. Without immediate reinforcement or a change in tactics, the convoy would likely suffer additional casualties and potentially be overrun entirely. She noticed that one of the enemy positions on the southern hillside had become less active following the grenade explosion. This might indicate that the blast had affected some of the attackers, or that they were repositioning for a different type of assault. Sarah decided to take advantage of this temporary lull in fire to move Private Johnson to better cover and potentially gather intelligence about the enemy's intentions. Working together despite his injuries, Sarah and Private Johnson managed to reach a more secure position behind the engine block of an armored vehicle. From this location, Sarah had a better view of the entire battlefield and could see that her fellow Marines were fighting courageously despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Their training and discipline were keeping them alive, but they needed a tactical advantage to turn the tide of the battle. From their improved position, Sarah could see movement in the tree line that suggested the enemy was preparing for a coordinated ground assault. Dark figures moved between the trees, and she counted at least 8 attackers maneuvering toward the convoy's left flank. If they succeeded in reaching the roadway, they would be able to attack the Marines from close range and potentially overrun the defensive positions entirely. Sarah realized that someone needed to warn the convoy commander about this developing threat, but her damaged radio made direct communication impossible. She could see Sergeant Martinez approximately 50 yards away near the command vehicle, but reaching him would require crossing another section of open ground while under enemy observation. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was allowing the flanking attack to succeed unopposed. Private Johnson, despite his painful shoulder wound, recognized the gravity of the situation and volunteered to attempt the dangerous journey to the command vehicle. Sarah immediately rejected his offer, knowing that his injury would slow him down and make him an easier target for enemy gunners. She could see the determination in his young face, but she also understood that his willingness to sacrifice himself demonstrated exactly why she needed to protect him. The sound of approaching aircraft engines reached Sarah's ears, indicating that air support was finally arriving in the area. However, she knew that close air support would be difficult to coordinate without proper radio communication, and there was significant risk of friendly fire if the pilots could not clearly identify enemy positions. The Marines needed to mark their own locations and provide targeting information for the incoming aircraft. Sarah made the decision to attempt reaching the command vehicle herself, carrying the critical intelligence about the flanking attack and hoping to restore communication with the air support. She gathered her remaining equipment and prepared for what would likely be the most dangerous movement of the entire engagement. The open ground between her current position and the command vehicle offered minimal cover and was clearly visible to multiple enemy positions. Before beginning her movement, Sarah took a moment to check on Private Johnson one final time. She ensured that his bandage was secure and that he understood his instructions to remain in cover until the situation stabilized. The young Marine looked up at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern, understanding that she was risking her life to protect him and the rest of the unit. Sarah burst from cover and began her sprint toward the command vehicle, immediately drawing intense enemy fire from multiple directions. Bullets struck the ground around her feet and whistled past her head as she zigzagged across the open terrain, using every evasive technique she had learned during her training. The distance seemed impossibly far as adrenaline heightened her senses and made every second feel like an eternity. Approximately 20 yards into her run, Sarah felt a sharp impact against her left leg that caused her to stumble but not fall. She realized that a bullet had grazed her thigh, tearing through her uniform and leaving a burning sensation along her leg. Despite the pain and the warm feeling of blood running down her leg, she continued running toward her objective, knowing that stopping would mean certain death. The enemy gunners seemed to anticipate her route and concentrated their fire on the area ahead of her intended path. Sarah was forced to alter her direction toward a small drainage ditch that would provide temporary cover, but would also add distance to her journey. As she dove into the concrete culvert, bullets struck the rim above her head, sending chips of concrete raining down on her helmet and shoulders. From the drainage ditch, Sarah could see that the flanking attack was progressing faster than she had initially estimated. The enemy fighters had reached positions within 50 yards of the convoy vehicles and were preparing to launch their assault. She realized that she had only minutes to reach the command vehicle and coordinate a response before the Marines would be fighting at close quarters against superior numbers. The sound of jet engines grew louder overhead, and Sarah could see 2 attack aircraft circling the area at high altitude. The pilots were obviously trying to assess the situation and identify targets, but without ground-to-air communication, they could not effectively engage the enemy positions. Sarah understood that her mission was now even more critical, as she might be the key to bringing devastating air support against the attackers. She climbed out of the drainage ditch and resumed her desperate sprint toward the command vehicle, ignoring the pain in her wounded leg and the continued enemy fire that tracked her movement. Her fellow Marines had noticed her approach and were providing covering fire, but the enemy gunners maintained their focus on stopping her from reaching her destination. Sergeant Martinez saw Sarah approaching and began moving toward her position to provide assistance and gather the intelligence she was carrying. However, his movement also drew enemy attention, and several gunners shifted their fire toward the command vehicle area. Sarah realized that her actions were putting additional Marines at risk, but she also knew that the information she carried was essential for their survival. As she covered the final 15 yards to the command vehicle, Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The enemy had brought indirect fire weapons into the engagement and was attempting to destroy the convoy vehicles with explosive shells. She dove behind the command vehicle just as the first mortar round exploded approximately 30 yards away, sending dirt and debris flying through the air. Sergeant Martinez grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her into the command vehicle, where radio operators were working frantically to coordinate with the incoming air support. Sarah quickly briefed him on the flanking attack and provided her assessment of enemy positions and numbers. The sergeant immediately began relaying this information to the aircraft overhead, while also coordinating defensive measures against the ground assault. The radio operator managed to establish contact with the lead pilot and began providing targeting coordinates for the enemy positions. Sarah could hear the pilot acknowledging the information and requesting confirmation of friendly positions to avoid accidental engagement. The coordination process was complex and time-consuming, but it represented their best hope for turning the tide of the battle. Suddenly, Sarah heard Private Johnson's voice screaming a warning from his position near the vehicles. She looked out to see enemy fighters emerging from the tree line and beginning their assault on the convoy positions. The flanking attack had begun, and her fellow Marines were about to face the fight of their lives. The enemy ground assault began with a coordinated rush from multiple directions as armed fighters emerged from their concealed positions and charged toward the convoy vehicles. Sarah watched in horror as Private Johnson, still weakened from his shoulder wound, struggled to bring his rifle to bear on the approaching attackers. His position was directly in the path of the main assault force, and he was in immediate danger of being overrun. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed a rifle from the command vehicle and sprinted back across the deadly ground she had just crossed, this time moving toward the sounds of close-quarters combat. Sergeant Martinez shouted for her to stay in cover, but she was already committed to reaching Private Johnson before the enemy fighters could reach his position. Her wounded leg protested with each step, but adrenaline pushed her forward through the pain. The attacking fighters were closing the distance rapidly, their automatic weapons firing as they advanced across the open ground toward the convoy positions. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from their weapons and hear the distinctive sound of bullets striking metal as they targeted the Marine defensive positions. The situation had deteriorated into the most dangerous type of combat, where split-second decisions would determine who lived and who died. Sarah reached Private Johnson's position just as the first enemy fighter rounded the end of his vehicle. Without time to aim carefully, she fired 3 quick shots that struck the attacker's center mass and dropped him to the ground. However, 2 more fighters were immediately behind him, and Sarah found herself engaged in a close-range firefight with multiple opponents while trying to protect a wounded Marine. Private Johnson, despite his injury and obvious pain, managed to engage one of the attackers with his sidearm while Sarah dealt with the other. The young Marine showed remarkable courage and composure under the most extreme circumstances, proving that his earlier nervousness had been replaced by the fighting spirit that defined the Marine Corps. Together, they managed to hold their position against the initial assault wave. The radio crackled with reports of close combat throughout the convoy, as Marines fought desperately to repel the coordinated attack. Sarah could hear the sounds of gunfire and shouting from multiple positions, indicating that the enemy had succeeded in reaching several of the vehicles, and that hand-to-hand combat was occurring in some locations. The situation was chaotic and deadly, with friendly and enemy forces intermingled across the battlefield. Above the noise of ground combat, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of jet engines diving toward the earth as the attack aircraft began their first strike run. The pilots had finally received enough targeting information to engage the enemy positions safely, and their intervention could not have come at a more critical moment. The timing would be crucial, as the close proximity of friendly and enemy forces made precision strikes extremely dangerous. Sarah and Private Johnson took cover behind their vehicle, as the first bombs exploded on the hillside positions where the enemy had maintained their overwatch and fire support. The concussion from the explosions was enormous, and Sarah could feel the shock wave traveling through the ground beneath them. Secondary explosions suggested that the airstrikes had hit ammunition storage areas or weapons caches. The aerial bombardment had an immediate effect on enemy morale and coordination. Sarah could see attackers breaking off their assault and attempting to retreat toward the tree line, abandoning their wounded comrades and any equipment that would slow their escape. However, several determined fighters continued their attack on the convoy positions, refusing to give up despite the devastating air support. One particularly persistent attacker had worked his way to within 10 yards of Sarah's position and was attempting to flank them from the right side. Sarah spotted his movement and engaged him with accurate rifle fire, but her shots went wide due to the awkward firing position and her own exhaustion from the prolonged combat. The enemy fighter continued his advance, forcing Sarah to make a desperate decision. She handed her rifle to Private Johnson and drew her sidearm, then moved out from behind cover to engage the attacker at close range. This tactic was extremely dangerous as it exposed her to fire from other enemy positions, but it was necessary to prevent the fighter from reaching their defensive position. Sarah advanced aggressively, firing her pistol as she moved and forcing the attacker to take cover behind a damaged vehicle. The close-range engagement lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours as Sarah maneuvered around the vehicle, while the enemy fighter attempted to outflank her from the opposite direction. She could hear his footsteps on the gravel and metal debris scattered around the battlefield, and she used these sounds to track his movement while positioning herself for the decisive encounter. As she rounded the rear of the damaged vehicle, Sarah came face to face with the enemy fighter at a distance of less than 5 feet. Both combatants raised their weapons simultaneously, but Sarah's training and reflexes gave her a crucial advantage in reaction time. Her first shot struck the attacker before he could fire, ending the immediate threat to her position and Private Johnson's safety. However, the physical and mental stress of the prolonged combat, combined with her leg wound and the effects of multiple concussions from nearby explosions, was beginning to take its toll on Sarah's stamina and awareness. She felt dizzy and disoriented as she made her way back to Private Johnson's position, struggling to maintain her balance and focus on potential remaining threats in the area. The airstrikes continued to pound enemy positions throughout the surrounding hills, and the sounds of ground combat were gradually diminishing as surviving attackers withdrew from the area. Sarah could hear Sergeant Martinez's voice over the radio coordinating casualty evacuation and requesting medical support for wounded Marines. The immediate crisis was passing, but the cost in human terms was becoming apparent. Sarah collapsed behind the vehicle next to Private Johnson, who was applying a fresh bandage to his shoulder wound with his good hand. She tried to assess her own injuries and determine whether she needed immediate medical attention, but her vision was becoming blurry, and she was having difficulty concentrating on simple tasks. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the combat was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and vulnerable. Private Johnson noticed that Sarah was struggling and attempted to provide first aid despite his own injuries. He could see that her leg wound was more serious than she had initially realized, and that she was showing signs of shock and possible concussion from the multiple explosions she had endured. The young Marine who had looked to her for protection was now trying to return the favor in their moment of mutual need. Private Johnson worked frantically to apply pressure to Sarah's leg wound while calling for medical assistance over his radio. Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly as blood loss and shock began to overwhelm her system. Her vision faded in and out, and she struggled to remain conscious as the young Marine she had protected now fought to save her life. The irony was not lost on either of them, but Johnson's determination matched the courage Sarah had shown throughout the entire engagement. Medical personnel arrived within minutes, led by a Navy corpsman who had been called forward from the rear of the convoy. The medic quickly assessed Sarah's condition and began emergency treatment while coordinating with Johnson to understand what had happened during the assault. Her vital signs were weak but stable, and the corpsman determined that immediate evacuation to a field hospital was necessary to prevent further complications. As Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, she could hear the sounds of helicopters approaching the area. Medical evacuation aircraft had been dispatched as soon as the convoy reported casualties, and they were now arriving to transport the wounded Marines to advanced medical facilities. The steady thump of rotor blades provided a comforting rhythm that seemed to help Sarah maintain her tenuous grip on awareness. Sergeant Martinez appeared at Sarah's side as the medics prepared her for evacuation. He knelt down and spoke quietly to her, expressing his gratitude for her actions during the ambush and assuring her that every Marine in the convoy owed their lives to her courage and quick thinking. Sarah tried to respond, but her voice was weak and her words came out as barely audible whispers. Private Johnson insisted on accompanying Sarah to the helicopter, despite his own need for medical treatment. He helped the corpsman carry her stretcher across the uneven ground to the landing zone, where the medical evacuation helicopter waited with its engines running and crew prepared for immediate departure. The young Marine's dedication to the woman who had saved his life was evident to everyone who witnessed his actions. As the helicopter lifted off from the battlefield, Sarah caught a glimpse of the convoy area through the aircraft's window. She could see Marines securing the perimeter and recovering equipment from the damaged vehicles, their movements purposeful and professional, despite the trauma they had all endured. The sight filled her with pride, knowing that her unit had survived one of the most challenging combat situations any of them had ever faced. The flight to the field hospital passed quickly, with the medical crew working to stabilize Sarah's condition during transport. Private Johnson held her hand and continued talking to her, sharing stories about his family and his dreams for the future. His voice provided an anchor that helped Sarah remain conscious and fighting during the critical flight to medical care. At the field hospital, Sarah was immediately taken into surgery to repair the damage from her leg wound and treat internal injuries caused by the concussion effects of multiple explosions. The surgical team worked for several hours to stabilize her condition, while Private Johnson waited outside the operating room despite his own need for treatment. His loyalty and dedication impressed the medical staff, who recognized a special bond between the two Marines. Sarah's recovery took several weeks, during which time she received numerous visitors from her unit and other Marines who had heard about her actions during the ambush. Private Johnson was a constant presence at her bedside, having recovered from his own injuries much more quickly. Their friendship, forged in the crucible of combat, had become one of the strongest bonds either had ever experienced. News of Sarah's heroism spread throughout the military community and eventually reached the highest levels of command. Her actions during the convoy ambush had not only saved Private Johnson's life, but had also been instrumental in coordinating the air support that ultimately defeated the attacking force. Military investigators determined that her intelligence gathering and communication efforts had prevented what could have been a devastating defeat. The formal recognition of Sarah's courage came during a ceremony at Camp Pendleton several months after her recovery, As she stood at attention in her dress blue uniform, still bearing slight scars from her injuries, Sarah was presented with the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation specifically mentioned her selfless actions to protect fellow Marines and her crucial role in coordinating the successful defense of the convoy. However, the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Private Johnson, now promoted to Lance Corporal, stepped forward to present Sarah with a small flag that had been flown over the battlefield where she had saved his life. As he handed her the folded banner, the entire assembly of over 500 Marines began to applaud spontaneously, creating a thunderous ovation that lasted for several minutes. The applause grew even louder as other Marines who had been present during the ambush joined Johnson on the stage, each taking a moment to salute Sarah and express their personal gratitude for her actions. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she realized that her courage had not only saved lives, but had also inspired others to strive for the same level of dedication and selflessness. Years later, Sarah continued to serve in the Marine Corps, eventually becoming a senior non-commissioned officer, responsible for training young Marines in combat tactics and leadership. She often shared the story of the convoy ambush with her students, emphasizing that true heroism comes not from seeking glory, but from the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others without hesitation or expectation of reward. Private Johnson, now a seasoned Marine with his own distinguished service record, remained one of Sarah's closest friends and strongest supporters. Their bond, created in a moment of extreme danger and mutual sacrifice, had grown into a lifelong friendship that exemplified the very best values of the Marine Corps. Together, they continued to serve their country with the same courage and dedication that had saved them both on that fateful day, when heroism meant the difference between life and death.